Welcome to Millions in Clean Capitalism. This is Josh. In this episode, I speak with Momodou Taal and Two Black about two of their recently released essays. We discuss the role of Black liberalism in the U.S. political landscape, particularly its relationship with the Democratic Party, and how Black liberalism often neglects the interests of the Black working poor in service of the ruling class. We contemplate the influence of social media, popular political discourses, and the Black elites capturing and commodification of Black cultural expressions for political and economic gain at the expense of the global working poor. Momodou Taal is a PhD student in the Africana department at Cornell University. He is also the host of the Malcolm Effect podcast. Two Black is a poet, member of the Black Alliance for Peace, host of Black Myths podcast, which can be found on Black Power Media. He's also the author of Laundering Black Rage and one of the organizers of the campaign to free the Pendleton 2. If you like what we do and want to support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. You can do so for as low as $1 a month. We bring you these conversations totally independently with no corporate, state, or grant funding. Now, here is Momodou Taal and Two Black discussing some of their work. To start us off, could you both give us a quick synopsis of who you are and your respective essays and where you're coming from?
Greetings. My name is Momodou Taal. I'm a PhD student in Africana Studies at Cornell University, and I am also the host of the podcast, The Malcolm Effect. I guess many PhD students will relate when they ask you what you're specializing in. I'm struggling still to get it down to a sentence, but so far I'm interested in conceptualizations of sovereignty and nation building, particularly in the era, in the kind of nascent stages of post-independence era in West Africa. And I take Guinea and the Sekou Touré as my site of analysis. In terms of my respective essay, so it's called Dear Black Liberals, Online Palestinian TikTok Activists Are Not Your Enemies. And I was commissioned to write this piece by the New Arab Statesman. And it was quite timely, actually, because I was also thinking to write something in response. I wrote something on Twitter briefly speaking about, and this is something I know Two Black's work engages in a lot, the laundering of Black rage, and also when we think about liberal elite capture. But particularly this moment that we saw, it seemed to be a shift, and I know we're going to go into it a bit more detail, but the shift from, growing solidarity, which we can trace back decades, but definitely the resurgence of solidarity between Black and Palestinian causes since the Black Spring of 2020. But what was particularly strange, and also we can talk about the peculiar timing of this, was out of nowhere, it seemed to be an explosion of beef between Black people saying that, oh, but what did I tell you about those watermelon people? And that would go viral, for example. Or what would, we have to talk about the anti-Blackness and that Palestine and the genocide in Gaza is not the only issue in the world. And we've got to think about our rights in this country. And we're always at the bottom, etc., etc. And I think my piece was trying to address that. Okay, this is a specific liberal rendering of Black history in the Americas, and also I would say a capture of what it means to be Black and Blackness in general in the United States. So my piece was trying to make an intervention and a response to that to say, listen, we must reject, for the sake of Black folk in general, though, for the sake of our own struggles and our own emancipation, liberation, freedom, what you want to call it, that we have to reject the kind of capture and liberal rendering of Blackness and reintroduce, and I guess not to say that, there's so many great scholars doing this work already, but I wanted my part to be a reintroduction again, or to add to that, no, we have a history of Blackness that was internationalist, that was Pan-Africanist, that understood the technologies that we see enacted and the violences that we see perfected and enacted on the Palestinians are all too often will then be used on Black people in the Americas as well. So I guess, yeah, fundamentally, a long-winded answer, long-winded response to say, I saw the bullshit online and I said, you know what, how can I kind of address this in a way that stays true to my politics, but also addresses like what seems to be a switch, quite a peculiar time switch as well.
No, for sure. Thanks for that. Yeah. And I mean, it's important to know, like you and I were talking. It's funny
Yeah.
we both ended up with Black liberalism in our title, but we did not actually coordinate that at all. That was taught.
Yeah.
Um, but we ran about Black liberalism all the time, so it was probably inevitable. Um, so yeah, my piece, Unburdened by Palestine, shedding Black liberalism for anti-imperialism. It was in Mondoweiss, which is primarily a news and opinion and just overall analysis space for the Palestinian liberation and cause. So I go by the name, for those who don't know me, by the name Two Black. I'm a poet, scholar, filmmaker, and organizer. I've I finished a film. I actually just got back from a film festival. The Pendleton Two, They Stood Up. It's a documentary film about two political prisoners. The Pendleton Two are Christopher Naim Trotter and John Baldwin Cole, and how they were persecuted by the state in Indiana in an attempt to save a man's life inside prison. And the guards attacked them, and they received 200 plus years in prison. And they are still locked up to this day. So work on that. And then also I am a Scholars, I just published a book early this year called Laundering Black Rage. Co-authored it with my co-author Russell Mawat, and also really co-directed the film as well. So that's a quick bio, the unimportant part. But yeah, so like you said, the piece, the Unburdened by Palestine, shedding Black liberalism for anti-imperialism. I was trying to just, I was responding to the discourse too, but I guess for me, the discourse is always reflective of something much broader, right? So there's these moments where these things pop up, and it's easy to just respond kind of generically to the discourse, but I find that boring. So I appreciate how your piece didn't just do that either, because we could just get caught up in that. And I don't think we really learn much, honestly.
Yeah.
So the discourse, like you said, just for those who may, good for you if you're not aware of it, online at least, was about um, you know, Palestine. There's different like enclaves of the discourse. So there's one where there was like Black folks calling them watermelon people, because watermelon is a insignia that people have been using to represent Palestine online, and calling them watermelon people, and claiming they were being attacked on TikTok by Palestinian content creators because they were calling them out for voting for Kamala and saying that means they're not down for the cause. And then, like you said, what came from that was this idea of anti-blackness, and there's these Palestinians trying to police Black people. So then and this is the narrative. I'm not saying I agree with it, but this is the narrative. And then the Black people push back on this and say we can be down. And there was one girl who was like, well, if that's how you feel, then I'm not going to support Palestine. But we can't be forced to choose between our rights and your rights. So, if we don't vote for Kamala Harris, then, we got to deal with Donald Trump, and that's terror of us. And even for Palestinians, I'll say, well, Donald Trump's going to be worse. He's going to do more genocide, whatever that means, to the Palestinian people. So it became this discourse where it became like the so-called rights or lives of Black people in America specifically, because that's another thing. This is not really dealing with the rest of the broader African diaspora, but Black people in America's rights are being pitted against like the Palestinian, not even just rights, but lives, and Palestinian, like, the genocide of Palestinians. And this became this argument on Twitter. And we're going to get to this more later. I don't think it just stays online, because honestly, if it was just on Twitter, I don't even really feel it worthy to respond to. I think it's part of a broader trend, even if it's, I guess, more expressed on an online website. So I was just trying to respond to that, but also wanted to show that Black liberalism specifically has a history of doing this, where we say, not we as in I'm a Black liberal, where Black people are supposed to say, hey, we need to get what we need to get for ourselves, and these broader causes, quote unquote, that shit over there, or these bigger, quote unquote, revolutionary things are not pertinent to this more pragmatic thing of achieving civil rights, of getting voting rights, of having the ability to, move wherever you want to move, and just the general liberalism of a capitalist society where you have the freedom of movement and the freedom of rights to participate in the broader capitalist economy. So, I go back to the We Charge Genocide document by the Civil Rights Council, but we really could go back much further. But the Civil Rights Council, led by William Patterson and W.E.B. Du Bois and others, were a part of this. And they had a document called We Charge Genocide that they brought to the UN, that was accusing the United States of genocide. And they had very well documented evidence to show this. And this is coming out of World War II and the Convention on Genocide, coming out of the Holocaust. So there were these agreed upon definitions of genocide internationally, and they try to use that framework to make an appeal more broadly to the world, that they're being genocided. But this document comes out in 1951 at the same time we're damn near at the height of this McCarthyist era. So a lot of Black radicalism is being crushed. Even the NAACP just 5-6 years prior was actually speaking about the United States living in peace with the Soviet Union and was criticizing Britain's position on Palestine just in like 1945. And by 1950, they're shedding communists from their ranks. So when this document came out, the NAACP and other Black newspapers denounced it, called it exaggeration, called it communist propaganda, and did not take it seriously. So this document, that if you read it, is very well positioned, and it positions Black oppression and the subjugation of Black people within a global context of imperialism, not just a domestic issue, that was pushed out. And then throughout the piece, I mean, people can read it, different moments where Black liberals sided with the establishment, with the state, even when something heinous was happening, and even when that was connected directly to Black people. So I'm not even dealing with in those cases or those instances. I wasn't even necessarily talking about Palestine, like when there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the United States had pushed Cuba to the edge because they after the Bay of Pigs and that debacle. There's documents that a lot of the Black leaders did not speak out against the United States actions, even though that could have brought the whole world to nuclear war, because they wanted to get integration and civil rights. So you just see the cognitive dissonance. If there's nuclear war, there are no civil rights. You know what I mean? And so on and so forth. So by the time we get to 2020, these same Black liberals are willing to sell out, the rights of poor Black people for their grants, for their jobs, for their positions, for their TV gigs. And they always do it under the guise of pragmatism, even though things have dwindled even since the 60s. They've always done it under the guise of pragmatism. So I cite like pieces going back to Cold War, like Dr. CBS called it Black Cold War liberals and agency reductionism. So they reduce the agency of the people by setting an agenda that's very narrow and does not deal with the broader concept, even though imperialism has the ability to kill all of us. So it's not really a question of one right over the other, because if you have one country that, as I note, controls, has a $1.5 trillion budget, when you add up really like all of the different facets that they have, not just the 800 million, and is at the lead of 74% of the world's military spending. You need to look at the U.S. NATO bloc and the non-NATO countries that fall under the U.S. bloc. That's not good for anyone, So that's the general argument I was making. It's probably a bit more spicy when you read it, because I was pissed off when I was writing it, but that's the general layout.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to touch on a couple of those things too. But I would like to also discuss a bit, and both of you kind of touch on this a bit here, but how much we should distinguish between like the online wars versus the struggle against Black liberalism in our daily lives, right? Because we've all had these debates and these conversations with people that we know, right? And how it seems at times a lot of the electoral pragmatism and betrayal of the struggles of the colonized, it's not merely an online phenomenon. I kind of mentioned this because I kept seeing people calling some of this stuff like, Fed work, and to be fair, I think a lot of that is true. Don't get me wrong. Like, I do think a lot of it is orchestrated by the state. But I do also think that like some of this is just, as Stu Black mentioned, liberalism, some of it is just expressions of like Black liberalism, and more particularly. And I'm really like curious at how you both have been able to situate this, because as Tupac also mentioned this as well, like there's a way to like discuss just how much, like, if it was just Twitter, I wouldn't even speak on it, because it was like it's just Twitter,
Yeah.
right? But I feel like we see like the manifestations of like online discourses um have like this kind of two-prong or way of like infecting actual offline organizing spaces or offline political discourse and things like that. And like those lines between online and offline have been largely blurred because of how often, because of how much we are dependent on the internet and on social media, right? So yeah, I'm curious to how both of you kind of situate this and also grapple with this, and seek to untangle this even in your own intellectual work, right? Because even I've had this struggle as well of like trying like not to focus too much on like what is being said online when I'm writing, right? When I'm thinking. But then I'm like, you know what I'm saying? I was born in the mid 90s, for example, right? And I know that like I grew up in the age of social media. Like that's when I had my, you know, my most important years, right? Um, so I know this, and I know most people around my age and younger, especially, but even older a little bit as well, have seen this. And there is like our lives are like have been defined by social media in some ways, you know? So yeah, I'm curious how both you talk about this as well.
Yeah, I think definitely it is a demographic divide. So you're going to absolutely see like a generational divide between younger folk and on older folks. I mean, I guess on more of an older crowd, you might see their views on Facebook, for example, as opposed to Twitter or Instagram or whatever it may be. But I think increasingly, if I'm being honest, not to say everything on social media, particularly that hellhole Twitter, is a complete accurate reflection of what's going on the ground. But I do
Right.
think increasingly the lines are becoming more and more blurred.
Yes,
And I think
absolutely.
Twitter actually does give you, it can almost be a barometer of what is bubbling up in certain places. So I don't take it like absolutely my point of like departure of analysis, but definitely I think you have to reckon with it. Just a side point. I mean, from time you have Trump going on to Aiden Ross to campaign,
Exactly.
you're definitely seeing the strength in which these Twitch streamers are having, for example. That's one example of social media and how they are impacting and they're impactful on everyday lives. I mean, you have Trump going on that show talking about young thug needs to get treated better, right? And then you have thousands and thousands. I mean, that stream was watched by 500,000 people consistently. I think we have to like reckon those are not small numbers, right?
And
And
those are
maybe
not
some of
all
them, maybe
bots. Those are not all
exactly,
bots.
exactly. They're not all
Yeah.
paid bots, and a
Yeah.
lot of the comments were talking about, oh, we're gonna vote for Trump now, or like also, admittedly, a lot of the folk that watch Twitch streamers are not of the aging, of not of the voting age as well, right? But I think yeah. So in my own work, I definitely think Twitter acts as a barometer for me in some ways. Not to say it's accurately reflected, but I definitely feel it reflects a sentiment at the very least. And it reflects a sentiment that you might not even always come into contact with in real life. People don't feel as emboldened to say certain things in certain spaces in the same way. I can only speak about my context being on the university campus, right? But I definitely heard that, right? Throughout the since October the 7th on campus, the usual, when are you going to speak about Sudan? When are you going to speak about Congo? And then obviously our job as organizers was constantly trying to say, again, this is not privileging the Palestinian issue over any other cause, but we're trying to take a united, solidified front through education and bringing in together. Okay, if you look at these connections, you can see the connections between what's happening in Sudan and Congo. But that's also to say when you're speaking about it in internationalist terms. Also, now with this election, I think liberalism is deeply important here because again, I would argue, and I know we all go back and forth on the question of intersectionality online, but in its most, I don't really want to go into its genealogy. I'm not going to go into all of that, but let's just say at least in its most current dominant instantiation, it has a liberal feel to it, right?
Yeah.
It's for me, it's about greater incorporation into the state, but fine. Let's talk about how it is at least worded today. So it becomes unsurprising that Crenshaw embraces Harris and emphasizes her Black womanhood, right? And I think what we're seeing, that what I've definitely seen in that, is that this is where anti-Blackness becomes wielded on against certain groups of people to say, "Oh, do you know what Black women are going through?" I hear that a lot. I don't just see that on Twitter and TikTok. I'm hearing that in real life as well, right? Crenshaw came to Cornell during the height of our campus organizing and didn't mention Palestine once. I did a post. I did a post about Crenshaw's coming, and I got like people from Cornell attacked me so much for saying, "Okay, how can you critique something that has been so helpful to understand the subjugation and oppression of Black women, for example?" And again, I see that again online because again, you're seeing it with talking about Harris. Oh, not too much now. Like I saw a post the other day, and it was, and again, several thousands of likes and several hundreds of reposts. Yes, I know Malcolm would disagree with Harris, but don't forget, Malcolm said the most disrespected woman is the Black woman, right? And that, and again, so you're seeing even those who are like quote unquote well-meaning are getting caught up in it because again, I would say the language of progress, dominant language of progress is definitely enwrapped and entangled in like notions of like what liberals see as progress, right? So yeah, so I guess along with answers to say, when thinking about the question of online and offline, not to say that online is be and end all, because a lot of people are just not involved, a lot of people are not plugged in. But I do think if you are plugged in, then these are discussions that you will come across in your real life as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you hold the intersectionality one so I don't get off into a different veer. But I will say there's a lot that we can said there. I think in terms of this online offline thing, I think materially speaking, like nobody's really one or the other. Like because you're always on a phone or on a device, physically somewhere. So you're not literally like on Twitter in some virtual world. Like you're still in the real world, right? So, or whatever you want to pick. So this idea that there's a fine line, I don't think holds up. Now, obviously, like you said, there are people who are more active in that world, like in that kind of like exchange. So their brains are going to be more influenced than when I talk to people who are not online like that. Sometimes I tell them some of this shit and they're just totally thrown off. But I think that some of the differences really are more about the vigor that people have about an issue, not so much the ideology of folks, right? It's more so like, oh, the people on Twitter are very rabid in their positions about things that are maybe tangentially how other people feel, but they don't build their entire identity around it the way that someone does online who spends a lot of time just on a device. So I think that's more kind of how I make the distinction. I did note in the piece, early in the piece, I think it is important to note because we'll often look at people's behaviors in these discourses, but there are things that happen behind the discourse that get us to the discourse. So, the K Hive, Kamala Harris's crew online, has documented history of harassing people and starting fights and pushing fake accounts to attack folks who do not agree with certain lines. And a lot of like in regards to Kamala Harris, and they use the same language that you were just speaking about, Momodou, like in terms of like this what Black women are going through. That is targeted. That is not an organic thing. And I think what gets people caught up is that they think that this is organic, right? That this is just because Black women do experience real shit in the world, right? So it's not that part is organic, but the way that is targeted and pull on your heartstrings, that actually comes like what was her name? Bianca Della Rosa, who claimed that she was the co-founder of K Hive. This is back in 2020 election, and before that 2019, leading into the 2020 election, they got in trouble for these things, and her account was known for harassing people, and people would it got to the point where some of the K Hive folks actually they doxed folks and they even harassed people's partners. They went to their homes, things of that nature. And then Sally Albright got caught making like having a literal bots. Like if I responded to one of y'all and as her, you would all of a sudden see a bunch of accounts retweet me and come back at you like immediately because she had all these bots. Like this is documented. This is in like a Huffington Post article. And some of the accounts that she used to retweet very often was Bianca Della Rosa, who claimed to be the founder of the K Hive. So the K Hive and just online wars, they have a major way in like pushing a discourse. Because if you can get something going, that's why I usually try to de-escalate with people online because I don't really want to get into it like that. You can get something going, people will forget what the original origin of the thing is. And we're arguing about a word or a phrase, and it's like this kind of proxy war for all of our different feelings about an issue, or about whatever we think. So I think that that's online. I think in real life, um, again, I don't think people are as rabid about these things because they just live regular day to day. They go to work, when they're online, they're probably watching, videos to laugh at and, real shorts and reels. They're not getting into threads about, abolishing black men or something, right? Like that's not a conversation that the average person is having, right? Like that's not a thing.
You want everyone to come for us today.
I'm just saying, like, that's not what people are doing on most days. They might be like abolished my partner, or they might I hate these niggas, but they're not like literally abolished that's not a conversation. They're not reading Sylvia Winter and all of that and trying to make that point, right? So whatever. But I do think some of the same kind of myths that you'll see online and the same kind of general logic, like I was
Absolutely.
saying, I think that's where you find like
Certainly.
the intersection. Like it's that people are very much emboldened by those, and some of the stuff you do see online you will hear in regular talk, especially the what about shit. People really tend to grab towards that. So why didn't she do this, or why didn't they do that, or the rank the top 5 of everything, or there are certain things that, because eventually what happens is people see it's popular on Twitter, and then a content creator on like ESPN or the news makes that a segment on cable news where the older crowd watches it now, right? And now they're going to get that. So it has a way of setting an agenda that even if the quote unquote everyday person, I put that in air quotes, has no clue who we are, has never read a thread, never gets on Twitter, maybe not doesn't even have an account, does not get into the discourse, that shit will trickle down, and kind of feed the way that they view things and the way that we kind of structure our social lives, just like any other, superstructural thing in the past. And even in good times, I always say black folks in America at one time were like tangentially nationalists. Generally they were very pro-black and not first black, but pro-black and black first, I should say. Like that's what they looked out for, generally speaking. And you'll see it in small things, like when we watch sports and we root for the black people, or we go see a movie, we root for the black character. You see stuff like that just pop up in everyday interactions, but they didn't build a whole politic around it, but it was a sentiment that kind of rides out. So now we see these sentiments from Twitter that are like, people are very bad, like clashing on. You'll see them show up in little conversations with folks who may not be that intense about it. And I think that's where you find the regular person is trying to actually route through life in a more serious way, I think, than people on Twitter. So those myths become real explanations for them, right? So it's like this idea of Project 25 and the oncoming of Donald Trump and fascism. Not that none of that's real, but the way that becomes a singular thing, and the Democrats are just rendered as decent and better than that because there's a real fear that the world's coming to an end and that black people are under attack. There are plenty of black folks that carry that. And then it's also, lastly, I think important to say, with all that being said, I noted in the piece at the end, and the last 3 elections, only 27% of black people voted in the last 3 elections. So it's also important to note that there's a large bulk of people who aren't involved in any of this shit. Now, in the presidential elections, you see it go way up. You'll see some 50, 60% turnout within voter age eligible population. But within, like the midterms and stuff, you're talking low, and then primaries. So a lot of this is demobilizing people. Some people get caught up in it and they are, very rabid. And then some people, I think, and this is just as damaging or more, are so turned off by it that now when you come to them as an organizer, when you come to them as trying to push any kind of politic. They don't even want to deal with it because they've just seen this world as just too much for them, right? So it's like this has a way of demobilizing people. So most people are not really engaged in like day-to-day politics, even on the electoral level, let alone on any other level. And I don't blame, I'm not necessarily blaming them. I'm saying this kind of stuff has a way of demobilizing people, even when you go to online.
Facts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I appreciate that breakdown. And I think it's like this. I'm really fascinated for one. And I think we're going to get into this when we talk about culture, but even this like the sentiment of like rooting for everyone black in a way that it feels so much less I don't want to say material, but it feels so much less
authentic.
Authentic, yes. And because it's always about like flimsy things, and it's not like I'm saying about celebrity winning an award or like someone getting a job, or like, it's always about a particular class of people that we are rooting for, and not necessarily about, again, like the working poor. You feel what I'm saying? And so this kind of gets me into the question about culture, right? And namely black culture being used as like a technology of laundering like liberal imperialism, right? And I say laundering specifically, shout out to Black, right? There's this idea, right? This term that you use often, and the way that Black faces of empire, whether in the case of entertainers or athletes or influencers or other non-institutional misleaders, right? Or in the case of Black politicians, especially so, right? Those who mobilize caricatures of being from or of Black culture, right, as a means of garnering support for its subsequently apathy of empire, if that makes sense. And so, and I think this is like, I think culture is one of the primary means by which this happens. I really do, and I do think this is one of the reasons why the DNC trots out, you know what I'm saying, the Beyoncés and the Megan Thee Stallions of the world, in such a pursuit. So, I'm curious what you think about this, especially because I think we see even in like Kamala's speech, right, and the way she like interrupted the protesters, right, who protested her speech or whatnot, and she had the whole incredibly rehearsed like little like response to the protesters. I can't remember exactly what she said, but it was really weird, and it felt really inorganic.
He intends to cut Social Security and Medicare. He intends to surrender our fight against the climate crisis, and he intends to end the Affordable Care Act. You know what? If you want Donald Trump to win, then say that, otherwise I'm speaking.
I got into a little bit of, I don't want to say trouble because it wasn't that deep, but some people in the comments under the Mondoweiss piece I wrote, I quoted that, and then I said her mammy for empire impression emboldened her audience, and there was people in the comments kind of reflective of this conversation, right? Like, I don't know about calling her mammy, like, and then my home Erica Keynes was like, well, maybe she shouldn't be a mammy for empire. I didn't call her. I just said it was an impression because
that's definitely what it is. Yeah,
she held this like, I'm speaking, because there is a certain aesthetic, like you said, that that Black women have in a positive way, where it's like there's like, yo, let's get on it. Like there's a way they keep us tight, right? So she's trying to she's pulling from that. And I remember I had a family member call one of my friends who's not even into, again, they're not connected to Twitter at all. And they didn't, I don't even think they really knew about what she was doing, like what the actual protesters were saying. It was just, they were like, she's really leaning into her Blackness. Like, this is an older person who's not on Twitter or none of that shit. And they just, and to them, they saw it as a positive thing because, and notice the time it came. It came at a time where her Blackness was being questioned. When Trump said that shit, not the NAACP, NABJ thing, and some of the folks online were engaging in that nonsense or whatever. I'm not interested in that conversation, but it is interesting how that response comes at a particular time, know. And it's and when you know anything about campaigns, these are not accidental, like they plan as much as they can out, right? So anyway, continue your question. You had me thinking.
No, that was basically it. And I think it's something, because I do think there's like these different forms of culture, right? These different forms of like mobilizing culture. It's obviously the musical expression or artistic expression, but it's also like those caricatures, like you mentioned. Like, and I think you made me for Empires. Honestly, I would say it straight up, like that's
And
what it is, and that's what it looks
last
like.
point on the sorry, I was quoting a black woman. That's why it was hilarious when people got
Yeah, I got you.
like Onye from Hood Communist is the one that said
Yeah.
so go ahead.
Gotcha.
No,
Gotcha.
but it's
No,
like
no,
you
no,
said though,
definitely.
Josh,
Go ahead.
that the kind of potency and strength of culture and the way in which it's allowed to collapse like questions of class.
Mhm.
It's allowed to collapse questions of the contradictions that exist within quote unquote the race. It's allowed to collapse all forms of what would be meaningful engagement with the question of actual politics. And I'll be honest with you, and it also allows in many ways like white people off the hook because now they can be like, oh, we're so kind of tuned into quote unquote black culture. Like, we had famous white women on Twitter with bigger, large accounts saying, when a black woman gives you this look, it's about to go down with like a clapping emoji after, right? But I said what it allows for me, it just obfuscates the question of real politics. And I'll be honest with you, it's like you said, Josh, this caricaturing of black culture, for me, it's just high disrespectful. I was talking about this last night with some people. And I said to myself, like, as a black person in America, even though I don't vote, but I find the whole DNC shenanigans highly disrespectful because you won't offer a single like piece of substantive policy, but you offer cultural references in its space instead. So you offer Meg the Stallion, you offer this nonsense about like, oh, what does it mean to be brat? For example, or even that's not particularly specifically a black thing, as far as I'm aware. But you offer all these cultural references as to say, as to say, to get the black vote is to have Quavo on stage, or to get the black vote is to have quote unquote certain entertainers and cultural, I guess, cultural icons. I don't think it's highly disrespectful to black people. Like, and again, even if like I saw some discussions that said, okay, we're trying, like, God forbid we ask a politician to give us a platform or to give us what they're running for. And that's not an unreasonable demand. That has nothing to do with, and that's nothing to do with like shutting down a black woman. It's to say, okay, cool, you are running to be the president of this country. And you're now wielding your blackness. So then, yeah, quid pro quo, like, okay, what is your black agenda? Right? What is your platform to deal with the issues black people face in this country? But instead, you think it's sufficient, which I think is highly disrespectful to black people. That's why I said it. I don't particularly have this fleshed out, but I said for me, there's nothing more people. So ironically, right? There's nothing more anti-black for me than to push cultural references in way instead of policy. That's very anti-black to me because that's saying to me, oh, black people don't need to, know the more high, quote unquote, high level understanding of politics and what will change their lives. What they do need is more and more entertainment, right? And I just find it highly disrespectful. I feel like, okay, what are you offering these people? So when I'm seeing this stuff, it's unsurprising though, right? I mean, we have the famous, it made the rounds once again. You have the famous Malcolm video where he's speaking about these are not leaders. These are, these people, for me, placate. They placate in many ways. It's a minstrel show in many ways too. It's just okay, we can kind of speak to our audiences in a way that they're familiar with, so they kind of put their trust in us, but we can also be palatable to white audiences because a lot of times also white audiences are consuming this content anyway. So I just find it, deeply disrespectful, and I'm just a bit surprised that people are still falling for it once again.
Yeah, that last point you said about white audiences, I think is more pronounced than even with Obama when he ran in 08 in terms of, I think Obama was doing things, culturally, we'll get to culture, but he was doing things that kind of signaled to black people, like, I'm still on your side, even though I got to talk to the white folks. That I think that's actually different than the world we're in now, where I think some of these black signifiers are actually not for even black people. I don't even think that's the target audience in some cases.
Yeah.
I think if you can tell white people and people, of like white folks primarily, but even some other, quote unquote, people of color, that they are in, proximity to a certain kind of blackness, that makes them feel morally upright too, right? I don't think it's anymore just because in 2008 when Obama ran, code switching and all this shit that people say online, which I'm like, why do y'all be giving away all the secrets? But anyway, like all this stuff that people say online now, like, these were really like intercommunal things that we knew about.
Yes.
We didn't really share that shit. It wasn't a way to talk about it. So there was a time when you signaled to Black people that you were doing something and we knew and the other people didn't know. I think those days are effectively over because we've given away all the game. So now when you're signaling to white folks, I think it's more, or you're signaling to a Blackness, it's not simply just appeal to Black people. Because I don't even know how many, I think some Black people do see through it. But to them, it's like, well, it's better than nothing or whatever. We'll get to fear as well. And then I think some actually do really buy into it. But I think more broadly, I think there are Black folks, if we're talking about the Black thing, but the Black people, Black issues, or Black people, I should just say, they live vicariously through these people. Like I think you even said it, Momodou, like in your, not, it wasn't in this piece, it was in the one you were quoted in, and you were like, you said Kamala Harris is not your auntie, so it's like, but there's this tendency to associate like these people are aunts and our uncles and their family, or they're us fighting in the corporate room to get to be heard. They're us in this space, where Black voices are suppressed. So the context just disappears, and just a Black person dealing with a bunch of white people is the same in all cases, even if that Black person is fighting to be part of that group. That like you said earlier, that class dimension disappears, and we all see ourselves kind of as a part of that, and then so their fight is our fight, and they exploit that because on some level that's a good principle to have on some level. Like you advance, I advance, you get forth. That's a good principle to have in a certain context. When you get idealist with it and you just put it anywhere to the point where you're, coming back to what sparks all of this, you are enabling a genocide. That is not something to aspire to, right? Like that's what it's doing. So it's like, I think, like Marx talks about the mental means of production. Like we also talk about the just the means of production, like the actual like production of materials and the labor, but also owning the mental means of production, as in the things that create the social reality, the things that create quote unquote culture, the things that create the day-to-day things that we do. Because if all we did was work, like my co-author Ross Su always says, we would be revolting every day. So we always need the coffee shops and TV shows and the movies and all the entertainment, because if those things went away, the reality we live under would be much clearer. So the mental means of production, the way the information is produced, the way the reality is like interpreted, that the mainstream media does, and even some of these so-called independent media institutions do, social media and such, that once those things are kind of pumped out, like once the kind of interpretations are pumped out, this Black petty bourgeoisie class is the ones that kind of receives that information, and then they are on the assembly line, and they pump that out, to the masses of us of kind of how we should understand it. So it might have used to just been innocent to say that this is your auntie or uncle. Now that is a marketing plan. That is on purpose. When you see people having the same talking points, like all over different social media platforms and all on cable news, they got the same talking points. They're in a group chat together. They're getting these from somewhere. This is not an accident, and they are part of that like mental means of production where they can interpret the reality. Like Stuart Hall had a quote, he talks about this. He says, in producing their reality, talking about the ruling class of social reality, in producing the definition of social reality, the place of ordinary people within it, they construct a particular image of society which represents particular class interests as the interests of all members of society. Because of their control over material mental resources and their domination of major institutions of society, this class's definitions of the social world provide the basic rationale for those institutions which protect and reproduce their way of life. So one of the things, this is in Policing the Crisis, one of the things that capitalism does via the state, and for those who know my work, I don't just define the state as just the government. That's a conversation, but via these different vehicles that they can push propaganda through, they can they can make it seem, coming back to what I was saying with black folks thinking that we are in the same shoes as someone running for president, you know, even though we make $12 an hour or something, like thinking that we're in the same shoes as them. Like they make it seem like the interests of all, like this is a broader way capitalism works, that the interests of the capitalist is somehow synonymous with the interests of the worker, right? So if you can make it seem like the black elite interest is synonymous with the interests of the average everyday black person, they will fight for you without you even having to, like you were saying, Josh, put anything in motion, right? Without you having to even necessarily, even though I was saying a lot of this is coordinated, like we all acknowledge, it doesn't have to be coordinated, because if you see yourself in that person and you see your interests tied to that person, I don't need the CIA to give you a job. You will do it yourself, you know? So that's just, I think we got to think about that. And then lastly, on culture, Rafiki Morris talks about is confused often. The songs and the movies and the things, he's like, those are cultural products. You know, like Walter Rodney talks about culture is a total way of life, right? And the cultural products are just reflective of the way of life that we're living. So they give us these cultural products, the songs, the movies, the, you know, Megan Thee Stallion dancing. And these products are the things that are reflective of just really where we currently are. So when we say the culture, like there's some mystique to it, it's like, no, the culture is just, it's just right currently in this moment is just reflective of capitalist culture, you know, and just because you can put black faces on it, or just because black people can participate. And that is what people, when people say, even say, are black rights, often what a lot of these bougie niggas are saying is like, I want to be able to play too. And if Trump gets in, I'm not going to be able to play. A lot of us can't play anyway, but I want to be able to play too. I want to be on the game. I want to be involved. If Trump gets in, a lot of us, I'm not going to be able to play. Right. So like, that's the culture.
No, but I definitely appreciate you saying that, because I think it's something to be said about, like, I talk about this quite often with regard to like hip hop too. Like, this is like, I think it oftentimes gets to be belittled to just being about or for black people, when like that hasn't been the case for at least 3 decades. If like, I don't think I just like, these are expressions of culture, right? Like a lot of these things, and as you mentioned, like the cultural products, a lot of these things are packaged in a way that to service empire, right, and to service and to also benefit white civil society ultimately. So, and I'm really fascinated by the ways that like identity has been so detached from politics. Ironically or not right? The idea that like identity politics in of itself, but like you divorce the two so inseparably, and so separately in a way that it's like where it's meaningless at this point. And I'm thinking about this specifically with like the continued specification of like Kamala Harris's Black womanhood, for example, right? Like, what about Kamala Harris's life, right? Since she became a prosecutor, resembles, you know what I'm saying, the cultural political reality of the masses of Black women, right? Like that is what like identity politics was supposed to articulate, right? Identity politics was taught to articulate this kind of like the specific material conditions of like Black women, or you know what I'm saying, other racialized or colonized women, or even colonized men, right? Um, but it's such an irrelevant aspect of her being, right? Other than what, when it is in service of empire. Like it's only like it's only a point of contention, right? It's only a point of like conversation because she's the first Black woman, right? But like there's no way that you can say like that she has truly, right, like
Yeah.
an actual connection to Black womanhood, a collective Black womanhood, a collective experience to Black woman, of Blackness even, quote unquote. And again, I'm not saying that these are ontological realities necessarily, so, because of course it's not, but I'm saying in this specific case, I'm not saying that she isn't a Black woman either, but I'm saying specifically how it is mobilized to kind of discuss her is really fascinating to me. And it's even like it's highlighted in a way that as if it matters in any other real sense other than the fact that like she is, and that's it. You know what I'm saying? And you would think again after Obama that we would like there would be some level of like evolution on that, and I just
Yeah.
haven't seen that. You feel what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah. And I think the Obama and Kamala comparison, that's why I was trying to get at earlier in terms of us trying to understand it a little bit differently. I think with Obama, one, that's literally the first of anyone. Obama signaled things in ways much differently than Kamala. This is not me arguing for Obama. I'm just saying, like, Obama had to actually marry a black woman to signal his
Yeah.
blackness. She does not have to do that. And I'm not
Right.
getting into who people date. I don't even really care
Of
about that.
course.
I'm just saying, like,
Yeah.
you have
Yeah.
to think about what that means, though. What's that signaling, right? So Obama had
Right.
to, that's what I'm saying. Obama had to be the black guy for white people explicitly, and then implicitly say, like, I'm down with black folks. I went to this church, even though I'm going to kick my reverend out. I'm going to kick my reverend to the curb. Or
Right.
I'm from Chicago. I'm a community organizer. Like, he had all these things. I have a black wife. I have black kids. I'm this, that, and the third, because his life similarly was not very consistent with how most black people grow up in the United States. It just wasn't. I mean, it's not a
Right.
question of whether someone is quote unquote black or not. It's just the actual experience is not similar. Like growing up
Right.
in Hawaii with a white mom and a father that
Similar
was,
to the masses of black
yeah,
people
it's
specifically,
just
right?
not,
Like
it's
this,
not,
like, yeah.
yeah. But there was a way that he coded himself to like explicitly kind of present himself as non-threatening and such, but then like, okay,
Right.
but I have all these other relations, and I'm gonna form all these bonds with the black church and black civil rights leaders. And that was how he brought together his quote unquote coalition.
Right.
Kamala
Right.
Harris has not even had to campaign. So Kamala Harris, like, I think what Obama
Right.
did was, and I say genius not in a complimentary way, but
Of course.
but as far as like the way he campaigned, that's why they won a marketing award in '08 for the campaign, because it was done very well to bring people together. Because originally black people didn't mess with Obama. A lot of people forget this. All the black leaders were with Hillary Clinton. If you go back and look, all of them were met with Hillary Clinton, because that's where black people were. That was where all the black misleadership class was loyal to, was the Clintons throughout the '90s.
Yep.
Obama was new, nobody knew him, and it was South Carolina that switched that, because Hillary Clinton kept running her mouth, and it came back to bite her because she's a shitty politician. So people forget that. But I think with Kamala, it's not. Kamala is what they're doing with Kamala is they're actually trying to attach her to an existing wave. Like this black woman, listen to black women. Black women are, God, black women, like their intersectionality. They're trying to attach her to a wave that comes out of BLM, and she just becomes an avatar that you can fill in. It doesn't really
Right.
matter where she's done. She doesn't have to make all these overtures to the black church. She doesn't have to signal blackness as much in the ways that Obama did. I mean, she has some things like, I went to Howard, or blah blah blah, even though her dad seems to be non-existent in the picture. But I'm saying, like, she doesn't have to work as hard to signal blackness, because there's already there's already kind of like signals and institutional kind of ideals built around blackness that didn't even exist when Obama,
Right.
because blackness wasn't mainstream like that in '08.
Yeah.
Blackness has been
Yeah.
mainstreamed and corporatized in such a way that if she attaches herself to it, it's already a done deal. Like, you already got half
Correct.
of the
Right.
population. Like, it doesn't get all black people. There's plenty of black people that are skeptical of it regardless.
Right.
Yep.
But you can already get a decent base because it's already been marketed that way. Obama had to build that infrastructure. She just attached herself to it.
Yeah.
If you think
And,
about
and,
it like
and I
that.
feel like I feel like, and I think that's why I would call like Obama, like, he was like the death blow to like to the civil rights era. Like I think he was like that final form of like the kind of failures or limitations to that approach, the dominant approach that overtook, you know what I'm saying, the civil rights movement. Of course, like, there was complexities politically speaking, and there was like radical or militant segments of it.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the cold war fucking liberals won. You know what I'm saying? Like, they won that era, and they were the ones that captured the movie. They were the one that captured that moment, and we're still seeing the kind of like ramifications and consequences of that. And I kind of touch on this in the book a little bit, but there's just something to be said, I think, again, about like, and that's why I think her position is so much less, I mean, so much more offensive to me, because so much of it feels fake. In a way that Obama, and again, like, I know you mentioned like the genius. I think it was genius. Actually, I want to be like, it was like, again, I think it was like the complete, like, I don't know, the way that he happened. It was so seamless, and he's so charismatic with it. And like, it makes sense why people fell for it. Of course, who wouldn't, right? Like, this is a handsome black guy who, like, you know what I'm saying, he said the right things all the time. and things like that. And then you had this person, Kamala, who's so much less charismatic, so much less like efficient with how she does it. And like again, that moment during her speech where she like, I'm speaking, that whole moment, like that, it felt so phony to me. And it felt so orchestrated in a way that like, oh, this is what this is. This is what this is about. This is about marketing. This is about marketing oneself to a specific demographic, and in a way that is like, and again, we've seen them for the last decade or so. We've seen these kind of like rhetorics in response to like Stacey Abrams, for example, like this, the way that Black women have become kind of like the face of the Democratic Party. They become like the saviors of it. They become kind of this like these moral virtue and whatnot. So of course, it makes sense that she's like the kind of final form of that. You feel what I'm saying? Exactly.
I mean,
but you got to
right.
speak about it. You got to speak about like, when did Black women become charged with saving the empire? Like it's like, once again, Black women have to pick up the pieces. Once again, it's us who are even though we're the most disrespected people, but we are the people that have to pick up the pieces. Otherwise, the empire will collapse. And the question needs to become, when did that happen? When did Black women become entrusted and charged with and were forced to carry the burden of, not like, we're not talking about a household, where I'm sure that is the case for many households, right? We're talking about like buttressing and ensuring the proliferation of one of the most brutal empires known in history of humanity. Like when did that become the role of Black women? And I feel like that's what really we need to challenge that much more, because I don't get why is that now being accepted. It's like, and then you hear it, things of like women's rights and abortion and the other issues. And again, these are real issues people should think about. And again, they're far more complex than what you see from both sides of the camp. They're far more complex issues, right? But I just get, and I think fundamentally, I think it just goes back. I mean, I would root it even before civil rights, actually. I think fundamentally, we just have to understand the United States of America has always been, has tried to present itself, its project at least, as an assimilationist project, right? And even though its terms of assimilation are, of course, varied, so the kind of access you're given to in the project is going to be determined on things like race and class, but fundamentally, it at least tries to present itself as an assimilationist project, right? And I think with that assimilationist project, it kind of also, in many ways, in my reading, it erases history in many ways, because you don't see the historical processes that go into build certain category or identities. You just see what you're seeing in front of you now. And then now when we're talking about something I did recently about the neoliberal subject, we are all neoliberal subjects, right? We are, and again, the project of neoliberalism wasn't just about, yes, it's an economic regime of accumulation. And I'm sure Two Black can give me 10 definitions of neoliberalism right now. But fundamentally, we're thinking about like, when you think of, my guest quoted Margaret Thatcher and said, fundamentally, we're trying to change the hearts and minds of people and build this and break this collective spirit. But it's just, I just find it interesting that we're dealing with neoliberal subjectivity, which is hyper individualistic, that erases history, that treats everything as a present and induces mass amnesia. But then we talk about Black women as a collective at the same time. So I just find, I don't know, I'm trying to just work. I'm trying to work through and think through what is happening here, because we're impressed on us is individualism, but then we're now told this is a distinct category group of Black womanhood that is now not just like to think about themselves, but then to be the ones that bear the burden and responsibility of ensuring the proliferation and survival of the empire. So I just don't know, I'm just trying to work through that.
Absolutely.
I think the collective symbol, I think that the symbol is collective, but the reality is supposed to be lived individually, if that makes sense. That might sound too academic, but I'm saying, like, in a sense that there's this idea of Black women is clearly about a general sentiment of Black women, and it has all these different ways that Black women can be viewed as heroes, as at the same time as sufferers who need to be rewarded because they've been sufferers due to patriarchy and white supremacy, and in the sense since these are real things that hold some weight, but it's like a symbol of collectivity. But when it comes down to the actual material way that it's lived out, it's actually very individualized, because what people will do, I've noticed, particularly within, certain bourgeois folks, they will use that symbol, and it just becomes almost like a buffet. You can pull anything from it. So when it's time to be radical, you pull Fannie Lou Hamer. When it's time to be more presidential, now I guess it's Kamala Harris or it's Michelle Obama. You have all these different Black women that are this kind of smorgasbord that you can pull from. I don't think this just happens with Black women. I think you could apply this kind of general framework across the board. But I think
Of course.
Black women saw there was a there I've never been able to do the deep research, so this is all just kind of a bit of a speculation. But I think in the 2010s, with the rising of like just different, there was a pushback, and I think correctly to some extent about the ways that sometimes that Black men may have dominated certain spaces, particularly in organizing spaces, right? So there was a pushback to that, and that was internal to, like, again, a certain context. So if we're talking about churches, we're talking about organized spaces, we're talking about we're talking about like just different contexts. There are ways that is true, but because it was on Twitter, because it was on Facebook, because it was in these kind of loosey goosey conversations where a lot of these people weren't even from those spaces, to be honest. It became a way to read everything, and then the things that I think were originally used in good faith to uplift Black women, to make sure Black women were recognized, became this, overcorrection in a way where people that, again, I don't even think had those experiences because they just learned about the shit online. They're not coming out of an organization like, these Black men don't listen to me and these Black men make us do all the work. A lot of these people weren't coming out of those spaces after a certain time.
Right.
They're learning about this literally on Twitter. They're not learning about
online,
this through the experience. So the women who really went through that, I really empathize with that. But it's like it gets to a point where it just becomes we really just float away from the material world, and it just becomes an idea. And once things do that, once you float away from the material, you can fit anything anywhere. And I think that happened in 2010s where it came out of BLM and those critiques, but that stuff went platinum. And then there were bad faith people in those spaces that used that to build up their own careers. They really played on those antagonisms and really like gassed those antagonisms between Black men and women up to move their shit forward. And at a certain point, especially people who were younger, because I'm old enough to have lived through that and remember it now. There are people that come into that, like I said, they don't have those points of reference. So they don't know what really drove it. And at some point, like, you just think that is like you said, that they think that becomes ontological. Like that is actually firmly what it is. And there's not really any changing. It becomes a static position as opposed to like a more dynamic criticism of what people were dealing with. No, that's just what it is. So there becomes these very fixed things about Black women that these like slogans and chants that get thrown up. And like you were saying earlier about being disrespectful, I think and when I talk to some Black women, they think those things are very disrespectful because it doesn't actually help Black women in real life, in my opinion. Like a lot of shit
definitely.
If you talk to Black women who are actually doing organizing and doing real work, a lot of this shit doesn't help them. It might help the person in a certain class position to move up, but it's not helping, I don't think, the average person. It wouldn't help us as Black men if, they're strong and they're ingenious, and that shit doesn't help you when you actually got to work. And now everybody expects you to do something. Now you're the avatar for everybody's shit. That shit does not help most of us.
Right. But it's fascinating too, because it's like, especially because of how little is required of that for that label. Like honestly, like even the Stacey Abrams thing, for example, I keep going back to because that was a very sobering moment for me, seeing the type of like the white folks, to like the white liberal folks, a lot of the white gay men, for example, and white women in particular, right, who were like the way they were talking about her, like it was like if any other period in any other context, like this, we would all recognize this is like deeply anti-Black. Like to talk about anybody, like any Black person like that, but namely this Black woman, Stacey Abrams, who again doesn't have a principle to her bone anymore. Right? We saw what she did with trying to get on Joe Biden's ticket and what she was willing to do, openly disbelieve a survivor of sexual violence in pursuit of the vice presidency, and then ended up not getting the vice presidency. Like I remember that vividly, right? But like this idea that like that to me, like that's an allegiance to like white patriarchy, for example, that like that it is never acknowledged though. But I remember people talking about I don't know. I think that point though about like organizing and even thinking about the way that Black Lives Matter happened and kind of honestly, I would argue 2020 was like it kind of died, right? And what is like I'm thinking about even the leaders, right? The quote unquote public leaders of Black Lives Matter and how is two or three Black women, for example. And it was like a lot of it was response to kind of critiques of like Black men dominating these spaces and like a lot of these people who led or again are the public leaders of this moment of the last decade of this mass protest moment, right? A lot of them got rich off this shit,
Yeah.
off the backs of who? Of Black, almost overwhelmingly Black men who were being killed by the police, right? That's an antagonism that has to be wrestled with,
Yeah.
right? I'm even thinking about someone like DeRay, who's a gay Black man, for example, right? Like this idea, and like we should understand, like right, like the identity does not grant one any level of like morality inherently so like it doesn't grant one of a solid or grounded politics necessarily so right but like still we still see these logics being trotted out in defense of a president right so it's like or someone's trying to auditioning to be a president of course and I just feel like all these aspects of like racial liberalism ultimately so is kneeling like is sitting us back rightward. I would argue. I feel like there's a shift happening, and I don't think this rightward shift is it's just Trump either. I think what that Kamala Harris speech was bleak to me. You know what I'm saying? That was one of the really to me that like the way she's talking about the military, for example.
Yeah,
you know?
that's where the real rightward shift is, not in a bunch of Trump voters.
100%.
Of course,
she's the Democrats.
Yeah,
Kamala is to the right of Reagan on Palestine. On like you know what is it? 1984. Reagan was like after 5,000 deaths after the siege on Lebanon. Reagan was like, nah, that's enough. No more.
George
no
Bush.
more arms.
George Bush too.
You know what I mean?
Christ.
Like this blanket license. And then she's on the right to so many other presidents when it comes to on the border issue. Like, so that's the real fear for me is like, and that's why I worry even more about the rhetoric of, I mean, it's inherently, it's super dangerous anyway to say that this group of people, Black women, are entrusted with saving the empire. But like for me, if you think of the history and the ways in which race and gender have been weaponized for certain discourses, it is totally unsurprising that we're at this moment, right? Because now you're going to get what is
absolutely
because when you don't have dialectical materialist understanding to how these categories emerge and the historical processes and perhaps more fundamentally material processes that undergird these categories and create these categories in existence, not ontology. Let's deal with ontology in a second, right? We're talking about historically contingent categories. Like when you divorce that, it becomes really scary that now you can posit this group as not just the saviors and the saviors of empire, but pushing people rightward, right? Because now there's an inherent virtue attached to that group. Right.
And that's an important inherent virtue. I think that's an important. Go ahead.
No. It's just really scary to me, man. I see that more and more. I'm like, oh shit. Like, but it's unsurprising, right? When you allow gender and gender to be divorced from material reality, race to be divorced from material reality, you can posit this timeless understanding of a category that is transhistorical, that is inherently virtuous and is inherently good. And I think fundamentally we have to talk about the explanatory power certain things have. Before it was like biology when it came to race. Then it became, then we went through culture, and now it's ontology. In many places, ontology has the explanatory power for race and the inequities that racial differences produce, which I think is fun. And I think once you have that, we've got a lot of work to do. We're fucked.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the. I mean, there's so many things to say there, but for me, all of this is the fundamental contradiction of liberalism is they want to have it both ways. They want to be able that's what we're talking about here. You can pull on this symbol of Black women and I think even not as much, but more generally Black people as being this progressive revolutionary group within the United States. I'm saying you can pull on that symbol and you can use that to shut down criticism. So you can actually not do anything for the actual people, but still get all the benefits of it, right, at the same time. Like that is liberalism anyway. That's what it always is. That's what I was even saying in my piece. Like you can discard Black people more and more throughout time and say you're defending them at the same time. So that's why I was like, it's not a contradiction. I know people are mad, and I understand that when they see Black folks doing this to Palestinians, I'm like, this is already what Black liberals have been doing anyway to other Black people. They've already been discarding them and telling us to shut up and shutting down any dissent, you know, from even the mildest criticism, not even radicals. I'm talking about just regular Black folks that are just trying to understand. You see these people to get on Twitter and do these like, you know, I'm going to explain Congress to Jermaine Dupri or what, you know, like, what are we doing? You know what I mean? So it's like,
exactly.
So these folks are, you know, marshaling out soldiers for empire, but never want to hold that's what they're doing. That's what I'm saying. They never want to hold it.
Right.
So like I said something on Twitter, I think I think yesterday, I was like, so if we say we're voting third party, that's a vote for Trump. Like that's what they'll say. But if they say that, you know, they're voting for Kamala Harris, they will also say, but we're not, that doesn't mean we're pro-genocide. We're just trying to, like, they get the benefit of pragmatism and the benefit of strategy and the benefit of all these things. They don't have to hold the downside of the position. Like, because everything has a contradiction, but they don't have to hold the contradiction. They can just be like, well, no, I'm doing it because I want to help Black people, but you can't just come out and say like, okay, even if I accepted that premise, which I don't, but even if I was, for the sake of this conversation, that by accepting by voting for Harris, that you are protecting Black people and you're protecting Black people on one side and she might be better on Palestine or whatever, and that's the best we can get, you know, but you're not owning the fact that is still enabling genocide. Like, you don't want to own that. You want to position it as, well, she's better than Trump, or it's like, even if all these things these people are saying is true, it still falls apart on its own premise. You know, like, I don't even have to argue with it. Like, it just falls apart on its own premise. Like, that still means 180,000 people. And that article came out like a month ago or something, right? So we're probably in, you know, so it's like, that still means genocide. And you have to be okay with that to vote for this person. And I don't even really care about voting like that. Like, I don't even get into the vote or not vote thing like some people, like, whatever. But I'm just saying, like, that is the position you're holding. And I'm saying, like, that is the fundamental thing about particularly Black liberalism. I would say even more than white liberalism, is you don't want to have to hold the L. You want to be able to be just as authentic and real and Black. And, you know, I'm from the South and I got a Black grandmother. You want to have all the benefits of the Blackness, but you never want to hold the contradiction of your class position. Like, that is the fundamental thing. It gets on my nerves. Yeah, but that's them.
Sorry, Josh.
No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, and again, these discussions that I seek to qualitatively assess genocide is, I don't understand it. I'm thinking, okay, Trump's going to be, I mean, how much, like, bro, 40,000, and people keep touting this 40,000 number. That was 4 months ago. Yeah, I mean, like, last time, I think they wrote their estimations was 186,000 deaths, and that's notwithstanding those under the rubble.
And again, that was a month ago. Yeah,
and that was a month ago. So I'm thinking to myself, how are you trying to qualitatively assess the differences between what we're seeing right now under Democrat and what Trump might bring to bear? I'm so sorry. Like, let's like, if again, hold the contradiction of your class position and hold that and hold it. Just like, fine, you don't want to vote for Trump. Fine, you think your right might be protected under Democrat. Again, even though I disagree with these things, because again, Roe v. Wade happened under who? Like, abortion happened, affirmative action, all these other things happen under who, right? Fine. And again, just a side point, I don't get it. Why is it Democrats are always hamstrung, but the Republicans are omnipotent when they're in power? Yeah. But anyway, that's
we never explain Congress when it's to save democracy. We don't expect that Congress can stop Trump. It's just Trump. But when it's on the other end, all of a sudden we need to know about the minutia of government. Like, okay.
Exactly. Trump can put 3 justices in 1 presidency.
Yeah.
Like, but okay. But I just say, I just find it. But again, but hold that position as well. Say, you know what? Yes, all these things are true, in which I believe my rights will be protected. At the same time, I'm still enabling what's happening to the Palestinians, and hold it. Yeah, I would again, I don't say respect, but I'll be like, okay, cool. You know what? I know where you stand, and at least that you've at least come to reckon with this contradiction, and you're standing on business on it. I think you're a terrible and shitty human being, but at least you're standing on business with it. But like, you're not willing to do that, and then so it becomes hella frustrating when I see these kind of takes.
Yeah, they don't
Yeah.
want to hold the position. And like I said, I think it's actually worse than white liberalism because white liberalism doesn't depend upon a certain authenticity in the same way.
Yeah.
But black liberalism really depends on authenticity. You can't even be a black liberal if you don't play into authenticity of some kind of blackness, even though they love to tell us it's not a monolith, a nuance. Again, all this shit disappears when their kind of image is on the line. Like, so yeah, they can't hold it. And I do truly believe if you can get these folks out the paint, like, you talk about like the world could move forward because they hold so
Certainly.
much, so much
Certainly.
is centered around them being able to hold that line of authenticity. And this is the real position that other guilty white liberals need to run to. And that's what I'm saying. That has changed in '08. I don't think, white liberals have always carried a guilt, but I don't think they carried the amount of appeal to authenticity or appeal to be doing the right thing. They've always been like that, but not to the same extent that they do now, particularly these white suburban mothers and shit. There's a certain appeal to that by supporting the quote unquote minority candidate or whatever, and they'll only do it if it appears popular,
Right.
So yeah.
No, that kind of gets us to like our next point too, because I think there's something to be said about, like, I think the things that thing that I have been most disenchanted with in this moment is the lying that we've been seeing, like the lying to oneself, but also to others. And I think y'all keep making this point, right? Like you have to sit with the fact that you are voting for like a butcher, like that. That is something that like you have to like reckon with. And if you can live with that, then like you can live with that simply. But I think you have to just accept that and like go from there. And again, I kind of align with like what Tupac said, but also what Du Bois said decades ago, right? This idea like one of these parties are going to win regardless. So I feel less of like about like, what I'm saying, guilting or making people feel bad about voting, because a lot of this shit comes down to fear, right?
Yeah.
So this which gets us to our next point, right? Because I try to be really empathetic and understanding when discussing this stuff with like ordinary people, family members, and local community, right? Discussing politics, namely electoral politics, right? Because I understand there's a lot of confusion and fear mongering happening, and it ends up guiding people's political decisions ultimately. So, right? But it's also true that hope has like this similar effect as well. Like that hope that another leader, especially if they embody like a marginal identity, tends to invoke these feelings of hope and in a way that innately de-radicalizes and again confuses where there should be clarity, right? So I'm curious about hope and fear both as weapons of the ruling class, right? And disciplining people away from alternative political struggles and instead in service of enforcing the stability of the dominant liberal order, right? How have you both seen this work out?
No, I think that's a great point. And it's interesting you said hope, right? Because wasn't that Obama's 2012 slogan? Kind of
Yeah.
2008.
That was '08. That was
Oh,
08.
eight. It was 08? Okay,
08
gotcha. Yeah.
wasn't '08 change you can believe in, or was it also hope?
It was hope. And
Okay.
it was
When was change?
Okay.
Oh, was that both as well, right?
he just remixed it again, but it was hope.
Gotcha.
Hope and change you can believe in. I think that's a pertinent point, right? Because it's interesting because it speaks to, for me, fundamentally the failure of liberal democracy and failure of like capitalism. Because fundamentally, why are we talking about hope? It's because we are talking about extreme forms of alienation. We're talking about the crisis of capitalism, which it creates and can no longer and continue and hasn't been able for a long time to solve other than export its crisis abroad, right? So when we're talking about hope, that is the liberal solution because it refuses to engage in any material change, but it can offer idealism, it can offer ideals, it can offer us cultural relics, and can offer us symbols. So I think I think that's where it becomes quite frustrating to see, right? Because again, these are people are facing, even though it affects them psychologically and people feel it on I guess it might not appear material to them. They might how they experience it anyway. I'm talking about phenomenology, etc. But we're dealing with alienation, right? This is Marx speaks about this. We're just dealing with straight up alienation because we're in the death pangs and death throes of capitalism. But again, rather than dealing with actual, okay, what is the cause of these what's the causes, and have a causal account of where we are and why we feel the way we feel. Even quote unquote all these gender wars and men's loneliness. This is all alienation, right? And rather than having material response to what people are really feeling, we're going to offer them like things like icons and symbols and cultural relics and say and talk a good talk, right?
And
Without
bash
offering anything.
and bash the other side,
And bash the other side
Yeah.
because it makes you feel better, right? And maybe this is where sometimes those who speak about the libidinal economy have some points, right? But I hear that. But I think, yeah, it kind of, it's unsurprising that I see this response, but again, it's once again so dangerous because again, it refuses to engage in what we're actually are seeing and actually experiencing at the material level. Yeah, I just feel like again, so badly missed the voice of like someone like Glenn Ford right now, right?
Man. Yeah, he would be.
Someone with such a piercing critical insight that was
Yeah.
able to get to the crux of the issue and explain it so powerfully. So
Yeah.
I think it's sad, man. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I said that in my piece. I said during each each U.S. election, hope and fear work hand in hand to widen the wedge between self-interest and solidarity. Right.
Facts.
And we have a question on a group issue, so I won't. That's the next. We'll get to that. But there's a way that hope and fear work, dialectically in a way. So because you can't get everybody on like all the hype we were talking about earlier, the Black women empire shit. That doesn't work on everybody. Like some people, especially Black folks, are not totally sold on. There's very strong parts of Black people who are not really moved by that kind of shit. So you got to get them more on like, what can you do or what can you avoid doing or what can you avoid happening to me? So the fear factor is, I think, more pressing for people that aren't going to be at a DNC or something, right? Who don't necessarily need to be energized in the same way. They just need to know that you're going to fight to keep Trump out of the White House or whatever boogeyman is coming down the turnpike. And I never want to dismiss the idea of a Trump or the white nationalist kind of like position. I don't want to dismiss that as like there's no legitimacy to that fear, like, because Black people have lived through it. And, so the idea of returning back to something, even if liberals are often returning back to the same things, but they're not signaling it in the same way, just the idea of returning back is a pretty scary thought for a lot of Black people.
Definitely.
Like that. So I get why people, like you were saying, Josh, you're empathetic, because I get why that scares people. I get why it scares not just Black folks, or at least like not just heterosexual, cisgender Black folks, why it scares, different communities within Black people. Like I totally get that. But I think at the same time, like fear, just like hope, can shield from the actual material reality. So there's this sense that, things can get worse. So the president never has to be analyzed. So even if your president is constantly diminishing, food prices are going up, can't nobody afford a house, homelessness is ravaging across the streets, and liberals are openly locking them up in California now. They can clear the streets. All of these things are happening right in front of you. And the fear of it getting worse, that's the trick, is like, if reality is already sucks enough, you don't want it to get any worse. Like that's actually more fearful if you're in an unstable position and that can become more unstable. You're like, no, I don't want to deal with that. So if you're gonna at least tell me that it's not gonna get any worse, or at least gonna get worse slower, then hey, I'll go with that. Because one of the things that fear does, it just diminishes what people believe is possible. So it diminishes their imagination. People like to throw these words around, but it really diminishes their sense of self-determination. So you don't necessarily have to give them much, because it's like, well, at least it's not whatever Trump recognized. Now, we all know that a lot of the things that Trump did, even in his first term, he just did them very loudly. And then the media, the next term, will not even talk about it in the same way. So people die within a year of COVID under Trump. I don't know the exact number, but a lot of people died. And then a year within Biden, more people died. But the way that was presented to us is we're getting a vaccine.
Mhm.
That was a big fight, and we get to go outside again and all of this. So the fact that just as many people materially died, actually more people materially died in the same time span, doesn't matter all of a sudden in the same way because it's not
Right.
being articulated in the same way, right?
Mhm.
Like that's the kind of reality. More people have been killed by the police, but because that's not what's on the front page, meh, so what people even are fearful of or what people think is going to change or whatever is often not based on a real measurement of the general reality, right? It's more so based upon like this idea of it, right? So now for these more bourgeois black folks, Trump really does represent a real threat to them because, he's going to come for universities, right? So he's going to come for DEI jobs. He's going to come for the things that they are often slotted in. He's going to come for nonprofits. He's going to come for the things where a lot of black middle to petty bourgeois black folks work. So those people do feel threatened. Is he coming for Amazon workers? In a
Mhm.
sense, like he's going to eliminate jobs for lower working class black people to work at? No. Is he coming for McDonald's workers? No. Is he coming for Uber drivers? No. Like that's not actually, like in that sense, those people's realities aren't going to be that much change. I'm talking about their actual labor, but there is a specific class of people who a Trump does represent a real threat to their position in society. And I'm not saying that should be dismissed. I'm just saying like the contradiction of liberalism is they want to make it seem like that is the position of everyone,
Mhm.
and that's
Mhm.
threatening all of us. And it's like, nah, he wants to get rid of y'all little representation economy, right? Like he wants to cut that out, and y'all don't like that. Now, again, I think that still has a downward effect for every black person on some level. So I'm not saying it means nothing, but I'm just saying like they kind of create the monster that they're scared of. Like the fear kind of creates the monster that they're scared of because they don't want to deal with the contradictions, you know, and then it just all
Yeah,
kind of falls apart.
certainly. And that kind of makes me think about something we're gonna ask or talk about later, but like this idea, for one, like I think politicians, especially like national politicians, they market themselves specifically to that class, to a kind of middle class or petty bourgeois class.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is who is overwhelmingly the beneficiaries of their policies too,
Yeah.
right? Like we think about this, even going back again. I know I think the point of Civil War. I mean, not sorry, not Civil War. The Civil Rights Movement is always a point of reference for me because I think that was another one of those moments. Like there's a couple different historical moments where I believe the state had the perfect conditions to like truly reckon with the crimes of racial slavery and truly try to like integrate Black African people, the masses of Black African people, into a kind of like equitable process. And there's a couple different historical moments where this has been the case, right? You have like the Civil War, you have the Reconstruction period, of course. Then you have obviously the Civil Rights Movement, and then you have like, I'm saying, more contemporary moments as well. When I'm thinking about this, because I'm thinking about how simply the state has been unwilling to grapple with that and has been unwilling to truly create a project where the vast majority of the world, the vast majority of its citizens, right, are benefits to its liberal project ultimately. So, but that can't happen. Of course, we know that. Why? We know that liberalism is ultimately inherently inequitable by its very nature, right? But I'm thinking about even more so how, like, at the data of who votes and who doesn't, and how we can look at that and try to understand why politicians overwhelmingly market themselves to the middle class and its aspirants. And you also think about the why the middle
And
class
it's
and
an
the petty bourgeois
important,
why.
you said, and it's aspirants. That's a very important part of it.
Yes, its
Because a lot
aspirants
of
is
us don't
very
have, a
important.
lot of us materially
Yes,
are not there, but the
of
aspiration,
course,
and that's what we were getting at earlier in terms of how
of
the
course,
aspiration trickles down, right? So even the
definitely.
aspiration is bringing people in that might make 25,000 a year. Yeah.
Right.
But
But
go
the
ahead.
poor is like largely disappeared from this discussion, though. The
Yeah.
poor is the black poor in particular is largely disappeared from this. The colonized, right, the imperialized is largely disappeared from like political discourses, and we're only seeing moments like this, like in Palestine being at the forefront because there's something so heinous happening, right, that we can't turn our eyes away from. You know what I'm saying? Because it's everywhere on our phones, right? So that's why it's at the forefront. But I'm curious about uh, how you guys have think about the state conditioning Americans to hide their problems as kind of micro group issues, right? I'm thinking about in Two Black's article. I'm about to quote you at length here, but you write, and I'm quoting here. Corporate media reports on polling where voters rank which issues they feel most impacted by. Rarely are the sources of the issues accurately explained, elaborated upon, or adequately organized against. Rather, both political parties rely on scapegoats to explain people's problems. The return of Trump, the evil immigrants are coming, radical left or right wing takeover, taxes, inflation. So voting becomes an exercise of keeping the scapegoat out of the office just as much, if not more, than the false feeling of progress. Imperialism, the dominant causes of our issues, becomes a deleted scene from the fear-mongering script we call a ballad, end quote. So yeah, I just want to like allow y'all to like this space to talk about this a bit, talk about how these kind of like belittling, incredible, like monumental quote unquote issues, right? Like a genocide happening in occupied Palestine to just simply being minor or individual single issues, if that makes sense. In a way, when we know, right, Palestine is like we're on the brink of a regional war. You feel what I'm saying? Like there's a regional war happening as a result of this genocide happening, and so it can't just on that level, it can't be seen as a single issue. Even beyond that, there's like domestic consequences and expressions of this genocide happening. And I just want to like allow y'all to talk about this a bit.
Yeah, I I think it was funny. The original name of this piece was before I actually wrote it was imperialism has always been a black issue, and I there's like a sentence or two in there that says that. So I think this was written earlier in the project before I moved it somewhere else because I didn't actually intend to go in as hard on black liberalism as I eventually did, but it just always finds its way. But like so I was trying to get at this idea of issues because me imperialism isn't an issue. Imperialism is the source in which many of these issues we complain about, you know, thrive. That's where they come from. That's what's driving the quote unquote issues. So I had like black issue in air quotes when I was gonna name it that. But yeah, like the issues are set up as things that don't really have relationships to each other, and they're put in and when you watch like mainstream news, there's this kind of like, you know, talk about demographic groups and what they're really concerned about, and they'll say the economy or, you know, the return of Trump or the immigration, and even, like I said, the immigrants or the radical left or the radical right or whatever, like these, you know, and these things have just become kind of a narrative game that don't really have much to do with like the world that we live in, and what is actually driving that, like why prices are going up is rarely explained. You know, like it's not really, and if it is explained, it's explained from the bourgeois perspective, which does not get into price gouging or, you know, corporate profits, or, you know, they'll say things like supply chain and all this shit. When, you know, it came out, you know, shortly after this inflation went up, like inflation happened, that most of this wasn't really connected to supply chain or getting more labor back to the yard to move this shit across the world. That wasn't really the main reason money, like things went up, right? So we don't get explanations of this shit. It's just like, you just know when you go to the store that a tray of chicken used to be $8 and now it's $14. Like, you just know that, right? And then you're like, so then you're supposed to ask the politician, well, how are you going to get my chicken price down, right? And that becomes an exchange, right? Like, so why chicken is expensive, and the fact that politician cannot pass a policy against imperialism, like they never can say that, right? So imperialism, it gets left out. And I don't just mean imperialism in this generic way of just like war and a country that's just mean to another country. That's not necessarily even imperialism. I'm talking about like the way that capitalism consolidates capital, you know, as I talked about in the piece, socializes production, creates this globalized economy, this supply chain, and then has to find ways to reduce labor, to reduce cost, and it requires stigmatized populations, that requires poverty, and black people in America and black African people more broadly across the world are always going to be at the bottom of that or near the bottom of that, feeling, you know, the impacts of imperialism. And just because a few black people get to represent you while you're going through that is not going to change it. That never gets explained though. You know, it's just why is chicken too high, right? It's just why are gas prices too high? It's just these things, you know. And then so those are like issues that are material material conditions, then you add the fear mongering that goes along with it, you know, the return of the boogeyman or the evil immigrants coming across the border who were never explained, you know, sanctions are never explained. You know, we don't know. So you sanction the fuck out of a country, all of a sudden, you know, they want to move. It's not really that complicated, right? They can't get basic needs met here, so they move somewhere else, you know, but that's a bunch of murderers and stuff coming across the country. So Kamala can run on there cracking down on it. And then we like, well, it's a black job. They're taking the black jobs, right? Or whatever, right? Like it just becomes nonsense because it's never explained. You know, so we're not even taught to think about it. And I was something I was going to make when I was going to make it about the black issue thing. I was like, we don't have a vote on imperialism. We don't get to vote on imperialism or against imperialism. We don't get to vote on capitalism. We don't get to vote on these things. So many of the issues that we're voting on are so far removed from the source of why we have them. So voting in and of itself does not deal with the material conditions because all of these things are already put in place. And then at the end of it all, when chicken gets high, now it's your turn to vote. You know, when you want a black person representing you, now it's your turn to vote. But all this shit that's put in motion, all these decisions that are made across the world about global supply chains and who eats and how things are extracted from the ground and where the weapons go and all the color revolutions, we don't get to vote on that. And so lastly, what makes this election interesting is the fact that a quote unquote foreign policy issue, you know, again, I don't reduce Palestine to that, but I'm saying the way that they're talking about it, this is the first election in a long time where anything outside the United States has even been discussed. Like you have to go way back to maybe like George Bush for the last time that there was any significant conversation on anything outside the United States other than the quote unquote immigrants. You know, like, well, nobody really talking about Syria like that when Obama was in office as
Libya.
Yeah, Libya. That wasn't really a thing, or you know, or Afghanistan, or nobody really talking about that. Even when Trump was in office, only thing we heard about was Russia, and that was totally about what Russia did to quote unquote us as far as meddling in the elections, even though that was deeply overblown. But we didn't hear about like the actual relationships, you know, of these things. They'll say China's taking our money, you know, China's scamming us. But I'm talking about like what is happening outside of the border, not what someone's doing to this country. You never hear about it. And this is the first time U.S. foreign policy in another region that is not like directly tied. I'm saying directly for the average person, like it's not directly tied to in a lot of people's minds to the day-to-day experience. But it's like, yo, you're genociding people. You know, if we dig deeper into policy, it is directly tied. But for folks who don't know, they don't even think it's directly tied. It's the first time we've ever had a conversation in like 4 elections or something. Like, you know, it's
definitely.
Yeah.
Facts.
So it's like, it just shows you how ridiculous the United States elections are, that it's been, when I was in middle school, the last time I remember us having a significant even conversation about anything else, you know, what was happening. And when most of the world is not the United States, you know.
Definitely. And I think too, it should be like specified as well that like one of the main reasons why the conversation is even happening is because of the protests, because of you know what I'm saying, people's mass resistance to, you know what I'm saying, the US's role in that genocidal project, right? And so I think that also needs to be like at the top of it, because I feel like people often like give liberals a lot of like I've been seeing with Kamala, for example, there's a lot of people granting her like the willingness to just to listen, quote unquote, right? And that actually really fascinates because it's like she has no choice, I don't think, and like I don't think she has like much of a choice because if she doesn't like, I don't know if she wins this one because I think it's going to be tight. You know what I'm saying? And I do think that like it seems as if like she has to cater to it in some way or another, right? And most politicians can just simply ignore it. They can simply, you know what I'm saying, pretend that shit doesn't exist.
I think that's part of why it throws people off, though, is because most politicians are not trained to campaign around anything outside of the border. They don't even have a playbook for it, really. And I think part of why there is this still a disregard, despite her fake empathy, is because I think there was an article in Al Jazeera about this. They're kind of banking on most people don't vote on foreign policy. Like if you go back to look at Cori Bush when she just got put out in her primary in Missouri, the St. Louis area, even though AIPAC threw a bunch of money into it, most of the campaign, if you go read about it, was not even about Israel or Palestine. They just beat her up on domestic shit. And they just put a bunch of money to beat her up on domestic shit. They wasn't, because most of the people out there didn't really, even the New York Times admitted this, didn't really have a much, like the average black voter out there didn't have much of an opinion on the situation because they didn't think it was tied to their reality, right? So even when AIPAC is throwing all this money at politicians, they're often not necessarily beating them up just because of their position on Israel. Now, if it's in a district that's got a high Zionist Jewish population, that's different. But in all cases, it's not always like that. They run on domestic things. They don't talk about international stuff, and they're banking on the fact that most voters don't really care about what happens outside the border. Like that, I think that's why. I think that's an under discussed part of why there's still such a dismissal. Yes, this is Zionist, yes, it's a Zionist, imperialist state and all of that. But I also think just on a very pragmatic level, they don't actually think they can lose on foreign policy because most U.S. elections are not decided by foreign policy. It would be epic if they actually lost on quote unquote foreign policy because it's just not very rare. Like I'm saying, within our lifetimes, we can think of maybe George Bush, and that was because of 9/11 and 2 fucking wars that people finally got burned out on that. And still, even that was because really the economy crashed because this idiot decided to cut taxes and go to 2 wars at the same time, So it's like, but generally speaking, like they are banking on the fact that most of us just don't really care enough. And when it really comes down to voting about anything outside of the United States, which should let you know the state of U.S. politics.
Right. Because in some ways, that's like true.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the, what I'm saying? And I think this kind of gets to our next point too, this idea. And it's not just even the petty bourgeois who's like this, but I do think there's like a general disregard or apathy to internationalism and just it's specific from Black folks that I want to touch on here a little bit, because you kind of make this point in the article, how Black politics often entails sacrificing the interests of the Black working poor, right, in service of the Black elite, in service of the Black elite agenda, right? And this is a continual process which has honestly, in my opinion, has dominated Black politics for at least the last near century, right? But you make the argument that this practice is a kind of rehearsal for when Black politics sacrifices the interests of the colonized people outside of the U.S., right? As we're seeing currently in the case of Palestine. But you state that we learn imperialism as at home well before we learn it abroad, of course. And I want to talk about this a bit from both I would love to hear both of your thoughts on this. I know you both have talked about this endlessly, but just talk a bit about what you've been seeing with this.
For me, I honestly, like I said, I originally was making this argument about but imperialism is a Black issue, and I changed it a bit because it hit me in the middle of writing it how similar the logic was, that when I wrote about it, like kind of what I guess inspired my book Laundering Black Rage and my essays was that sense of disposability of poor Black people, the way that particularly poor Black men, often even disabled, but poor Black men are the ones that are killed disproportionately by the police. If you live in a white suburban neighborhood, you are much less likely to be killed by the police than someone who lives in a highly occupied, ghetto, that the city has put all their resources in to quote unquote keep crime down. Your interactions with police are just going to be much higher. Therefore, the likelihood of you being killed by them, especially how they see you as, as a problem, it's just more likely that if you live in a suburb where crime's a rich suburb or affluent, at least where crime is not seen as an issue and police are not really deployed there. It's not that people aren't committing crimes or doing harms. It's just that police are not looking for it, right? So, in a place where stop and frisk and all those things are allowed to exist, poor Black men, when you look at the actual numbers, are primarily the people who are killed. That's just a fact. But somehow those are the people who don't seem to benefit at all from the 2020 initiatives, like, because they're not the ones getting book deals, they're not the ones getting all the grant money, they're not the ones, getting the TV gigs and being able to talk about race, and it's just not happening. So the rage in response to those killings gets, I mean, I don't want to get too deep into my own theory, but that is what pushes these Black elites to the top, because they're already positioned in those places of society anyway. The poor Black people are not. So that is already a cycle that happens domestically, where Black folks are regularly taught to just disown that for Black capitalism and buying Black or whatever. That just does not benefit those people. And that's just today. Again, the piece goes back further of how there's been a consistent disregard for poor Black people for the quote unquote progress of the Black elite, right? So if that is what you're doing regularly, if that's just the way that things go, and you've been able to convince the masses of Black people that the interests of the Black elite, at least in some cases, is attached to their own progress, you already are used to discarding people who are being genocided, who are being killed, who are experiencing the worst things possible, poverty. You're already used to it. So, and those are people that live down the street. Those are family members. That's neighborhoods, So why would it be hard to do that to folks who live on the other side of an ocean?
Right.
That's just, it's not that, it's really not. So for me, it was like, oh, this isn't actually, as shameful as it is and as immoral as I think it is, it's not really that, that deep for a lot of folks. It's like, yo, you already are in a system of capitalism that disregards people all the time, and you live with it, and you lie to yourself about it. You do all the things to rationalize it. You tell yourself that being in this room is for the culture, right? Like being Black in this room is for the dominant Black folks. So you do all this anyway. So why would a genocide really penetrate people like that?
But just to add to that too, like, I absolutely agree with everything you said, and I think that was so well explained in terms of learning imperialism at home before to disregard imperialism, I guess. But what I've been thinking through as well is, and I have mentioned this in my piece, the way in which Blackness itself is operationalized and weaponized to collapse forms of solidarity with people around the world, right?
Like American, specifically American Blackness, I would like U.S. American Blackness. Yeah,
exactly. That's what I mean. So like when we think about, and again, we can talk about the project of like assimilation or the liberal rendering of the civil rights era, particularly, and what dominant narrative won out, right? But when we even think about like the conversations of Blackness, it's not a universal category. It's not treated like that. It's like doing it for Black people. Even then, which Black people are we privileging in these conversations, right? Because again, it's like, even though again, I understand that people may not have there's not so much an appeal to foreign policy that comes in people's minds when they're thinking about who to vote for. But when we're thinking about the ways in which Blackness is able to be mobilized, and for me, it's very myopic. And that's deliberate. Again, I don't want to get into this bullshit diasporic wars, right? Because I can already imagine the first thing is, well, you're a Brit or you're a continental African, all these bullshit conversations that I hear, right? But for online and in real life, just a side point, I never knew I wasn't Black until I came to America in some circles, right? I was shocked at that. I never heard that before.
You should write that article.
Definitely.
I never knew. I was like, okay, cool. But I said to say, and again, this is all talking about the rightward push. We're talking about the greater integration. But fundamentally, it's like when we're talking about Blackness, it is a Blackness which is more to North America. It's myopic in its scope, and it comes at the expense of all of Black folk around the world, which I find, and not just Black folk around the world, against working class Black men as well in the United States, or working class Black folk in general in the United States, and then further than that, Black folk around the world. So even the way we have talked about this capturing, or this capturing of Blackness itself, which is extremely limited, but then it's being weaponized to collapse form solidarity with specific other groups within the quote unquote race and outside the race as well. So I think this is controversial to say. I don't think I'm there yet. I still think I do use blackness in my work, and I do use the concept of blackness for explanatory power and certain things. But I think even myself, I'm having to re-engage. I'm thinking, because the way in which it's used, I'm thinking, do I have to, is it a excavation
Right.
project? Is it a reintroduction project? But I'm trying to think through the ways in which I have to now use blackness, because the way it has been wielded, specifically anti-blackness, right? Specifically the
Right.
way anti-blackness is used, and we all know the camp that has become prominent because of that usage. I constantly have to think about I constantly have to think about now in my own work and in my own speaking, because I still use blackness, right? I use it in certain
Right.
ways. One of my professors who I love dearly, Professor Siba Grovergy, and I always quote this which he says, "Blackness is not my color." In effect, I'm paraphrasing, but blackness for him is an orientation in the world. It is what many philosophers, what people say, what is the unthought in so many people's thinking, right? How is it that the formation of black subjectivity is in such a way that it allows us to understand humanity in a way that white people just don't have access to, right?
Definitely.
So I think it's personal, and I use that, and it might just be a good rallying call. But unfortunately, I'm still holding out with that term for now. But I don't know where I'm gonna go with it, to be honest. I don't know what I'll be
For
interested
sure.
to hear what you think.
Yeah,
I
yeah. Go ahead, go ahead.
oh no, I was just thinking that like because I mean there's two, because on one hand I'm like, okay, so has there ever been a point in like the history of blackness, the history of anti-blackness, right? As a dialectic, right? Because anti-blackness exists because blackness exists, right? But if there has there ever been a history, a moment where like blackness was ever ours, for one, right? And this is getting into like the Pan-Africanist territory, of course, like the folks who like I have like comrades and friends who really believe that we need to let blackness go as a descriptor, even.
Yeah.
And now I'm like I tend to almost agree. I usually use the term like Black African, for example, because to me, blackness is more so just a description of like a relationship to capital, a relationship to land, and a relationship to like, you know what I'm saying? The project of like the US, the project of to the West, right? And so like I'm thinking about even thinking about how we discuss um again anti-blackness in the ways that it is mobilized in such a way, and I'm seeing similarities to the way that like anti-Semitism is mobilized, right? And I'm curious about how both of you think about this as well, because it seems to be that we are headed towards a means by which, and I'm glad that you like said this earlier about talking about the capturing, but to me, the more specifically, the commodification of blackness as a kind of like political, cultural, economic, analytic almost. Um, but like, how has black anti-blackness and then subsequently blackness as well been mobilized in such a way to be in service of empire, right? And again, both online but also offline in organizing dynamics as well, right? The kind of worst and most reactionary impulses regarding ontology, right? And ontological um, claims to oppression, for example, right? And they're mobilized in a way that like ends up working in tandem or in service of whatever the empire is spouting out or expressing itself in whatever which context, right? And again, I want to make this clear. We see this exact same phenomenon with anti-Semitism as well, and anti-Semitic discourse as well, as a kind of means by which the state disciplines um, against anti-Zionist criticism, right? So I'm curious if you're both like seeing this as well, and like what you think about this.
I mean, I would.
You can go ahead
I'm
too,
gonna
Black.
let my man's take it because I don't even, I don't even say anti. I actually don't even use the term anti-blackness. Like
No,
I
I hear
rarely even say it.
it.
I get it.
Um,
I get it.
so I'm not saying it's not a thing. I don't find it very useful in writing, in most cases. But maybe that's just because the topics I tend to tackle. I think again, I think the issue is the Americanism of it, right? So it's if blackness is part of a, and then maybe this is the criticism of just using black as opposed to African, and I can accept that criticism because if blackness is simply just is just based upon being in the United States, or even if you try to internationalize it and just call it black, and you don't tie it to any kind of land, you don't tie it to any kind of real destination or any kind of political objective, it's just a vibe, then you can do whatever you want with that.
Yeah.
You know, like you can do whatever you want, especially at this level of capitalism. You can do whatever you want with that. So, you know, I think there was a time where, you know, Black African people here in the United States, even liberals had some identification with Africa, with, you know, even if it was just for a week in Kwanzaa, right? They did something. And I still think that exists with us. I don't think the FBAs or whatever they're called and the ADOSs or the general norm, but I think that there is a way, like we were talking earlier, where I saw social media can affect things with people who aren't even into that. So there are plenty of people who would now claim ADOS, whatever. But there has been this push, and I think a lot of this is like the 1619 Project shit that has tried to make Blackness seem like very firmly American, and even radical Blackness seem very firmly American.
Yes.
And by associating with that, it cuts it off from the rest of the world in any serious way. You know, and this isn't the first time this has happened, but this is maybe the most effective time. I mean, we're talking about Black Cold War liberals. Part of their project was to demonstrate a certain kind of patriotism to the United States, you know, and that was part of why they severed with internationalism. And, you know, Gerald Horne talks about the compromise of 1954 with the, you know, Brown versus Board, and how there was a shift from more class to race conscious things. So that's always been in the ether. But yeah, I think Blackness that cuts you off from understanding the world, because this is very simple. It's just understanding the world, understanding that borders do not define everything, you know, and understanding the world in general, and becoming obsessed with these cultural things. That this is where social media, I think, has been the most influential in terms of like all this cultural shit that social media has made around Blackness. Just really, I'm old enough, I'm in my mid-30s. This shit was not a conversation in the 2000s, you know. So if you would have came here, bro, like back in 2005, you wouldn't even, they might have made fun. They might have said some anti-African shit, but it wasn't you know, it wasn't gonna be none
It
of
wasn't
this.
that I'm not Black.
Yeah. You know, it wasn't this wasn't a thing. Like people didn't joke about, like, you know, mac and cheese and greens, and like we didn't do that's a very online thing. It was not a conversation, you know. So that has made Blackness, has truncated it. But you know, and then lastly, and this is a book I probably never write because I can't prove this theory, but I always say my little personal hypothesis is that we're living through like a Revenge of the Nerds situation with some of these Black folks. So Blackness was not really allowed for a lot of them, because in a different era, you had, you know, Blackness was more seen by, it was defined more by like the ghetto and the hood and being hard.
Yes, exactly.
You know, so a lot of these people were not really allowed to feel included. So there's been a project, I argue, over like the last 10, 15 years to expand Blackness to include all these nerds that really weren't included when they were kids, you know, and this is like a kind of a payback project, you know. So they've come back at all these folks, and now they can claim Blackness through these signifiers that don't require them to live near Black people, that don't require them to struggle with Black people, or only struggle with certain types of Black people, you know, because they're still hurt because they got called white growing up or something. You know, like this is a very like, I mean, again, I can't prove.
I'm ready for this book, man. I'll help you write it.
I don't like to psychoanalyze people, but that's my kind of like, just being around some of these like folks. They were in the gifted and talented programs or something, and they just don't feel included. There's been kind of a reactionary taking back of Blackness by these petty bourgeois people. You know, and although I'm all for different types of expressions, I don't think Blackness should be limited to being a thug, obviously, or whatever. You know, I don't think it should be limited to heterosexuality or anything like that. But, you know, in the attempt to try to open the door for some of those expressions, a lot of these losers were able to get through that were not really included, and they've been able to hijack it, I argue. And and since they're in these positions where they get to define Blackness, they get to push a lot of us out. So there's a way that even this anti-respectability politics thing becomes a way to really just shit on like poor Black people, because they don't see things in a way that, you know, is more palatable. they might express some reactionary shit here and there because that's just how they move. And that's a way to just push them out the door, because now you can use that as a measurement if they're not progressive enough in these values, and you can just push. So that's
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I know we have to go here in a second. So, and I know we can talk about this for hours on end, but
days.
Exactly, right. But it reminds me a little bit because there's such a great emphasis placed on the performative nature of Blackness, or like what we see as like, again, they did that distinguishing between the culture itself, right, or and versus like the productions or the expressions of a culture. You know what I'm saying? So like there's like um this performative trying to always prove it and express it in a way that I feel is really inauthentic, and I think that's why I think Kamala like offends me so much a lot of times, really. But I'm thinking about, even I was watching, like, I remember a couple years ago, maybe 2020, around the pandemic, a bunch of like the older, like mid 2000s, I mean early mid 2000s, like Black TV shows, sitcoms, like Girlfriends, things like that, came on Netflix, and I remember watching those. And like, and even like, again, they're mostly like these Black sitcoms, right? And so like, take it with a grain of salt. But like, there was a level of like authenticness that I felt with these shows, that it felt like it was like every episode didn't feel like it was beating me over the head that these people were Black. And that
they weren't, you know what I'm saying? They weren't trying to remind you every moment, breaking the monologues like songs in kids movies or something, right?
But
like,
every show, the last decade or so, it feels like it's beating me over the head and constantly having to prove the authenticness of a Blackness, and like, it gets into this like racial authenticity. And I don't want to get too deep into this, and that's why I think that like the debate itself is kind of, because we don't have enough time. So the debate itself is like, I'm not trying to say there's a one way or one dimensional way to be Black, but necessarily, but there's a way that to be inauthentic, right? And there's a way that a lot of this stuff is grounding itself, and again, a lot of it's grounding itself in service of liberal democracy, I would argue, in service of empire, ultimately. So, and obviously, and it's happening in a way that is getting people out of internationalism. It's getting people away from, you know what I'm saying, critiquing these things, if that makes sense. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say very quickly, because I know we gotta get off here, but like I think one thing it gets on my nerves about the whole thing is they've made it about expression. It's not a political thing. Like, when something Rasul,
it's not. It's depoliticized. Yeah.
So we get into a debate about what is Black and what's not, for the sake of what? Like, so even if it is Black or it's not, for the sake of what? Like, what is the goal?
Exactly.
So that's the liberal part of it, is just simply for the sake of you being able to liberally live however your Blackness is, right? Your Black, and it's just, so that becomes the argument. So like something Rasul always says, like, he's like, if we're not, he's like, for him, Black is a political category, not a social category, right? So if like what was said earlier, so if we're not working to do something, then what is the point of any Black unity or camaraderie or expression? Why does any of this shit even matter? Like, to the point of what? If the point
awards,
if that's the case, then I don't care. I don't need to nod my head to you as the only other Black person in the room. I don't. If the point is solidarity and all these things is to accomplish something. It's not simply to just say, hey, you got dark skin, I got dark skin, the end of the day, right? Like, and you have that kind of camaraderie. So when things actually emerge, I have a bond with you that gets us into to actually struggle together. But if it's just about the expression in and of itself, that's why I don't have those debates with them, because I don't really care. Like, at the end of the day, what are we doing? You know, so it's like,
right.
You know, it's funny because I start teaching on Tuesday. Even though we can talk about my relationship to this university, but I'm starting my own class, and the class is called "What is Blackness?" So I'm just, it's quite funny that it's coming up now.
Yeah, I guess I could go off on that.
But that's also a thing too. Like, I don't know if we know. To be honest, I don't know if there's a coherent or like one dimension. Like, you know what I'm saying? It's like, because it means so many things to so many different people, but it's also, historically speaking, like, there's like I never know, and that's why I say, when I use it as a descriptor, right? Like, I use like Black African, namely, and people are always asking me for that, what that means, and I'm just like talking about its relationship to, like, to me, it's relationship to production, its relationship to like the land, its relationship to like the capital. But I think then there's also people who like will point to like more cultural expressions as for what Blackness is and what that represents. And I think that, to me, is like so much less of an interesting conversation, honestly, because a lot of this, you know what I'm saying? And that's why we're getting
it's a bastardized narrow nationalism that's even
of
worse.
Cultural nationalism, I would argue.
Narrow cultural nationalism that but at least that was tied to some kind of independence. This shit
Exactly.
doesn't get that. Like it don't,
Exactly.
like it's just because it's
Definitely.
liberalized, right? But
Right.
narrow. I want to say narrow because all cultural nationalism isn't. I think sometimes they get bashed too broadly.
Yeah,
But
I agree.
Yeah.
narrow cultural nationalism, I think, has always had that tendency. But now we're looking at something worse than that because most of these people making the argument for blackness probably couldn't even explain Karenga and what they were trying to do back then.
Facts.
You know,
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So yeah.
Yeah. Nah, but this was great though. We
I
should
love
probably
this.
stop this
Thank
here.
you.
And we could have talked about this for 5 days back to back because there's so much that we got to get off about Black liberalism. And Deruba makes this point, right? Like that, like in order for us to do anything, I think it's the first thing we have to focus on is the Black bourgeoisie. And I think that's
100% agree with that.
100% agree.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is great. I appreciate you both.
Bye.